Hello there. My name's Spencer Hess, and I'm giving Lori a break from doing her normally scheduled programming by doing a series on a book called Native: Identity, Belonging, and Rediscovering God by Kaitlyn Curtice. The only reason I read it is because I joined a Catholic worker group that did a book club over it, and because I wanted to be involved in that, I agreed to read this book, even though I can immediately tell that I found it thoroughly distasteful for reasons that we're going to get into and are kind of complicated, and partly owing to my own neurosis and sensitivity to ideas. The reason I wanted to do a series on this is because even though the book is quite bad, it is representative of the way lots of people think and view the world. So one example of this is she writes regularly for Sojourners magazine, whose editor is there on the left. His name is Jim Wallace. I went and saw him speak when he came to a megachurch here in the Kansas City area, and I, to be frank, couldn't stay awake because the message he's putting out there, like one of the things he kept saying is don't go right or go left, go deeper. And certainly strange to have to fly in a Christian speaker and magazine editor to tell us that God is beyond partisan politics. One example of the supposed social relevancy of such things is the controversy that developed at Baylor University down in Texas after she gave a speech at their chapel about the need to decolonize the church and society. She got the campus conservatives mad, and parents complained, and then campus Democrats defended her. It was a whole thing. That, if nothing else, helped advertise this book.
So when we are grounded in beauty, when we walk the earth, when we ask those questions, we have the space to examine the systems that we participate in. Systems like colonization or white supremacy. We ask ourselves questions as we love one another.
I think when she was talking about what it means to decolonize society, it seemed to be a mix of returning power to indigenous peoples, but also standing against capitalism and patriarchy.
So that's the relevant background on this book. Going forward, I just want to make the disclaimer that these are only my thoughts, not Lori's or any group I'm affiliated with. And to put my cards on the table, my commitments are first and foremost one to Christian anarchism as laid out by people like Nikolai Berdyaev and Peter Morin and Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement generally. And secondarily, I have Marxian commitments. Marxian as opposed to Marxist. Marxian means that you hold to the materialist critique of how capitalism functions and orders society. But you're not as convinced on Marxist political theory that says, a working class movement and or a political party leading the working class is going to take hold of state power and seize the means of production, and through some sort of central planning is going to shift things towards a new socialistic mode of production. But nevertheless, I think if you lose sight of the way that economic incentives majorly influence people, you get into weird territory. There's, of course, also an asterisk to put out there that I'm a straight white male, and therefore everything I have to say about this book and these topics is inherently suspect, if not irrelevant. I will leave you to decide if my arguments are reasonable and sound or, fueled by unconscious hate and supremacy and a lust for domination and or profound insecurity and fragility.
God only knows why he cursed me to be a straight white man.
So the thesis of this review is that after having read the book multiple times, I can tell you how Kaitlyn Curtice identifies, but I have only the vaguest sense of how or to what or to whom she belongs. or what her rediscovery of God actually means. So let's run through it. She identifies first as a Potawatomi woman and then as a Christian. There's a quote from the introduction where she says, "I'm on my own journey, a Potawatomi woman's journey, and I will share with you what it means to be a woman who is a citizen of the Potawatomi nation and descended from European people, a woman who is a Christian and yet who fights against systems of Christian colonization that do not reflect the Christ who lives in beloved unity with everyone and everything." She summarizes her past. She talks about growing up on reservations in Oklahoma and New Mexico, and then her parents' marriage falling apart, moving to Missouri to a much wider and more evangelical Baptist environment, where eventually her mother marries a Baptist preacher. She writes that, "In the comfort of a new home, I spent my teen years living as any middle-class teenager in a small Midwest town might. It was the first time I shopped at an American Eagle, or at a mall on a regular basis, for that matter. In those years, poverty, trailer parks, and reservations were no more. But memories stirred when I visited my dad on some weekends. Now there were Bible studies, a small public school full of teachers I got to know and love, and numerous True Love Waits rallies and other youth group events. In this season, there was barely an acknowledgement of the Potawatomi parts of myself." She eventually goes off to college, she gets married, and she begins to question various things about her evangelical indoctrination in her teen years. Though she's not fully clear about this, she basically indicates, I think, that she moved into an even more solidly middle-class life, working as a worship leader at an evangelical church, while her husband set about building his academic career. And then, for the purposes of this book, she had an epiphany. And while out on a hike, quote, "I had an epiphany, that moment when the lens of my life zoomed out and I saw truly for the first time what Potawatomi people once experienced, a history of forced removal from Indiana into Kansas with the trail of death. In that moment, I was reminded of the women who walked, nursed their babies along the way, some 660 miles, just as I stood there nursing my 1-year-old son in the middle of a wooded area, the trees breathing over and around us. There, standing over crinkled wet leaves, I suddenly understood what it meant to be Potawatomi. I felt the weight of my entire body center down in my feet, as if my steps were slow motion, engaging the pulse of the earth with every movement. I suddenly understood that ancestors sometimes come to us in the oddest ways, and mystery speaks to us when we are least expecting it." Now, this is, to my mind, interesting for two reasons. One, she's claiming that this realization came to her from her ancestors through the medium of nature, and not while she's embedded in any community. She's just walking with her partner and her kids out in nature. And while I know I want to downplay past wrongs or be flippant or glib about the subject matter, it seems strange to me that to understand what it means to be Potawatomi would have this intellectual vision about past traumas suffered by your people. And that's what it means. Now, she never exactly lays out why this is or what it is. This is just the type of thing that when I'm reading it, I found so troublesome. But with that as the sort of inciting incident that led to her writing this book, now we're off to the races. As the book flits about chronologically and rhetorically, and we hear stories and hortatory orations about how to be indigenous is to listen to the land and the animals and to other human beings and Mother Nature, and to be indigenous is to be a water protector. To be indigenous is to be a truth-telling storyteller, quote, "so that no one forgets that we are still here and that we've always been here. In a world in which white supremacy still holds power, we remain because our words remain, just as our stories remain to tell us who we have always been. And all of that is political because our very existence works as a larger narrative for liberation, freedom, and peace." She talks a lot about how she believes in an admixture of decolonial theory, postmodern deconstruction, and liberation theology that aims to name and dismantle cis-heteronormative white supremacist patriarchal systems that are making the world worse for everybody. Now, I'm not a crit lit person, but somebody who wanted to tell me that this book's well written would have to do some real fast talking. There's a lot of redundancy. Annoyingly, from my perspective, her texts are littered with the current left liberal anti-racist terminology that functions as the strange mixture of sociology and therapy and politics and finance. So you hear lots of incantations with terms like intersections and erasure and naming and voices and bodies and spaces and centering and equity and accountability, etc., etc. There's poetry where trees are always whispering to her. There's a shockingly parochial American naivete, too, because for all her ranting about the horrors of whiteness and imperialism, there's not one mention about how America's military-industrial complex has footprints all over the globe, oppressing people of color the world over. Or a sense that revolutionary theory critiquing the same state of affairs that she's critiquing has been going on since modernity began. And however much she insists that she's deeply rooted in the church, until a few years ago she'd never heard of Lent. But okay, so all of that aside, we can at least check the first subtitle off the list. What is her identity? She is a Potawatomi woman. Where things get weird, though, is as soon as this individual Potawatomi woman belongs to a tribe. What does that look like? And this is where we hit a point where I have very little patience for the type of argument she's trying to make. Because so far, okay, she can identify however way she wants, on whatever basis she wants. But as soon as you tell me that a central part of your identity is its communal nature, then you would have to explicate what the nature of the community that you're embedded in looks like, does. And this is where the book totally falls flat. She makes no real argument for that. And then one starts to suspect that she has to complain so much about what's problematic in the world, and especially white supremacy and patriarchy, as a cover for the fact that ultimately she has very little community, very little authentic connection to her Potawatomi nation. And I'd submit that a choice instance of this is a passage I put up here on the PowerPoint, where she writes that sadly, institutions are often run more by their rules and regulations than by a desire to accept and hold people where they are, with all that they are. And then here we go. So my community is the birds who chirp outside my window, wherever they are on the journey. Community is the people I've found online, who teach me something new every week, if not every day. Community is the neighborhood we live in, and it's the Oklahoma dirt that still claims me and the waters of the Great Lakes who call to me. Community is the human family and my creature kin. Community is journey in and of itself, and that may be one of the greatest and most challenging calls of our lives. It is the thing that sharpens us, hurts us, heals us. It is the thing that leads us home or to a new home we did not know we longed for. Community is the miracle that reminds us we are still looking, still searching, and that faith can be a partner in that journey. Now that is a novel definition of community, if ever I've heard one. Now we'll circle back around to this topic, but for now I think it's worth taking a detour and talking about Pocahontas Gate, which, if you don't know or remember, is a feud Führer Trump and Elizabeth Warren had, where Elizabeth Warren had been claiming that because she had a certain amount of Cherokee ancestry, that she was Native American, and then I'm not fully clear what she was supposed to get out of it. I assume just social capital in left liberal circles, that she wasn't a white woman. And then Trump made fun of her for being a liar. And so she has an extended discussion here that is one of the few, positive things where it's like, okay, this has broadened my perspective on how indigenous perspectives look at these issues. So let's run through it. She says, Elizabeth Warren is not claimed by the Cherokee people, and yet she made a public effort to stake a claim on their identity for herself. Test results do not equate kinship with an indigenous community, yet Americans flock to DNA tests to give them answers to this question: am I Native? Daniel Heath Justice, an academic writer and member of the Cherokee Nation living in Canada, explains it like this, quote, "The simple fact of DNA relation isn't actually kinship, or at least not entirely. To be a good relative, to be fully kin, we must put that relatedness into thoughtful and respectful practice, individually and collectively, and take up our responsibilities to one another and to the world of which we're a part." So right here, they're basically making a distinction between what we typically think of as race in modernity, which is it's just a matter of genetics, and ethnicity, which is somewhat a matter of genetics, but much more an issue of language and belonging to a community and lifestyle. Anyway, she goes on. Despite all the ways she's working to be an ally and spokesperson for Indigenous peoples, Warren nonetheless is breaking the very laws of kinship and belonging. By taking a DNA test to say that she's part Native American, she is essentially telling all tribes, especially the Cherokee people, that stories told within non-Native families about that one Native relative aren't problematic, and that Native identity can be determined by a simple test. This is exactly what Warren's experiment in DNA testing has done. Solidify the idea that anyone can take a test and claim to be racially Native, while erasing the actual cultural identity of Indigenous peoples. In the fight between Christian conservatives who side with Trump and Christian liberals who side with Warren, Native peoples who oppose them are left in the middle, traumatized over and over again, mocked for the very identities that we hold to be sacred in our own cultures. In early 2019, right after Warren held a rally to announce her run for the presidency, Trump tweeted at her, saying, "Today, Elizabeth Warren, sometimes referred by me as Pocahontas, joined the race for president. Will she run as our first Native American presidential candidate? Or has she decided that after 32 years, this is not playing so well anymore? See you on the campaign trail, Liz." Curtice writes, "This tweet, mocking the Trail of Tears, the forced removal of the Cherokee people and other southeastern tribes from their homelands, left Cherokee people the target for racist hate speech and toxic stereotypes that have been around for centuries, now exacerbated by this battle between a woman who claimed Native identity and a racist president who doesn't care who he harms. It is important to remember that Indigenous voices are not homogenous, and Indigenous voices should be listened to on all sides of issues like these. If we want to talk about these issues and center Indigenous experiences, both sides of the political spectrum are guilty of using and abusing Indigenous identity for their own gain. We must address this reality in our political and religious spaces, because if we don't, white supremacy will continue to hold power. My hope is that Warren will apologize in the right way, by speaking about the settler narratives that often erase Indigenous identity, and that she will then build long-lasting relationships with Indigenous peoples, because we need to see more stories of solidarity in our midst, of power to overcome systems of oppression and erasure. White supremacy within our politics and within our churches should be addressed on a number of levels, but if we cannot admit that we have a problem in the first place, nothing will ever change. DNA tests will come out, people will lay claim over a culture that they have no part in, and our ideas of true kinship and belonging will be made into a mockery. And I believe all of this greatly grieves the heart of God and destroys the sacred love with which we should respond to each other. Our political arenas and our churches are spaces in which we largely ignore the oppression of Indigenous peoples, people of color, women, LGBTQ plus folks, and disabled people, because we only see that individualist God who looks at our sins and yet ignores the bigger picture of what we've created and have been complicit in creating. Now, while there are a number of positive things to be learned in here, I don't think that you have to be like that kid at the beginning video from Baylor complaining about how she's against capitalism and patriarchy to find these passages, to apply one of her favorite terms, problematic. Because so much of what she argues for is so clearly correct that it's hard not to get seduced or sucked into basically like the riptide of her implicit argument. Because what's easy to agree with is, should churches be places where people just pray to an individualistic God that doesn't care about their society or these individuals' role in society? Should churches be oppressive and or exclusionary? No. should white supremacy and partisan politics of a conservative nature be centered, to use one of her terms? No. If we can't even open our eyes to these obvious messed up realities, will anything ever change? Probably not. Or if they do, it's because some crisis has been triggered and we're basically forced to change. Should Trump be nice? Yeah, that would be nice. Should people try and be respectful of other people? Yes. Is Elizabeth Warren a liar on a lot of issues? Yeah. But, and here's the catch, here's the riptide part. When she claims that if Warren could eventually build long-lasting relationships with indigenous peoples, because we need more stories of solidarity in our midst, of power to overcome systems of oppression and erasure. So you're saying potentially a Democrat like Warren could be a good candidate? Could, if we just support people like her, or like the Squad, who she also likes, then everything will be fine? Then we will finally rise up and not only overcome systems of oppression and erasure, but we will do so because we'll have to have built systems of inclusion and abundance and equity. And for me, here's where things break down, because I am super fed up as a leftist and as a Christian. Yeah, Republicans suck. But as long as we're stuck in a double blackmail where we've got to support people like Warren, then it's over. And what I find so unpleasant about the thrust of most of Kaitlyn's arguments is it really does, once you scrape off the exterior edge of radicality, what she's voting for is, I really wish Elizabeth Warren could be even more woke to indigenous issues. Which is to make the assumption that to be a creature like Elizabeth Warren or a Joe Biden is to not already constitutionally be incapable of doing what Kaitlyn would like her to do. So I say all that, but then if you do some poking around, what you'll find is that it does seem like Elizabeth Warren did apologize to the Cherokee people. Now, it's disputed how genuine it is, and as she says, we need to listen to multiple perspectives from the indigenous communities on every issue. So I don't want to say that it's all well and good, but it does seem as though she made some attempts to make amends. Also, if you get on her website, you can find policy papers where she explicitly does call out white settler colonialism. She makes vague commitments to reparations. She does talk about the need to empower indigenous peoples to exercise their sovereignty. So the more you read this, the more you're like, Elizabeth Warren is the candidate for Kaitlyn. I mean, this is the woman who also said that whatever Secretary of Education she puts in is going to be vetted by an 8 or 9-year-old trans kid.
Here's my plan, Jacob. I'm going to find just the right Secretary of Education, but here's what I plan to do. I want to make sure that the person I think is the right Secretary of Education meets you and hears your story, and then I want you to tell me if you think that's the right person, and then we'll make the deal. Does that sound good? What do you think? Good.
So this is another reason why the book is so annoying to read, is that it puts me in this weird situation. I don't even like Lion Liz, but it puts me in this weird situation where you feel like Kaitlyn Curtice is simultaneously Warren's biggest fan, but also isn't giving her a fair portrayal in this book. And the stories and the document I'm listing, by the way, all came out well before this book, at least if it was published. Now, maybe there was some weird overlap between when she had to turn it in and when things happened. But These are all things that occurred before this book came out. So just to briefly recap, this section is relevant because, for one thing, I legitimately learned something insofar as belonging to Native American tribes is a matter of ethnicity and relationship, not one of race or descent, at least purely. But it's also characteristically annoying because it puts me into this situation where I'm reading this and I'm thinking, Kaitlyn Curtice is a Warren Democrat, if ever there was one, and yet she's not, I don't think, being fully fair to her position. To which she would say, well, actually, I'm above that because I'm indigenous, and I just want Warren to have better relationships with my identity group, and then things will be better. To which I'm like, well, but if America has been founded by white supremacy from the very outset, why do you have this faith in Democrats? And I understand if she's like most of the people that I know who hold this position, the answer is, well, but the Republicans are worse, so we can take what we can get. And I'm like, all right, well, you've retreated a whole lot. And perhaps part of your problem is if the Democrats in general and Warren in particular know that they are the lesser of two evils, then your vote is fully captured because they know you can go nowhere else. So why would they even bother catering to you in all but the most half-hearted and minimal of ways? Because there is literally nowhere else for you to go. Because what are you going to do? Secede or organize some third party? No. So you're stuck. And all the time I'm reading this, I'm thinking, well, this wasn't even really supposed to be about national level politics. I thought this is about identity and belonging and rediscovering God. And why are we still not learning more about what it means to belong to a Potawatomi woman? In this 180-page book, we get maybe 5 pages about topics that are specifically Potawatomi. We get a tribal history where it explains how they used to live in the Great Lakes with 2 other tribes and how the Potawatomi role was specifically to tend to the fires of the people, that over time migration and forced removal from Europeans and Americans exerted pressure where their culture and their languages and their dialects shifted, that eventually they were pushed out from Indiana to Kansas. And then at some point, some of them were lured from Kansas to Oklahoma with the promise of U.S. citizenship upon taking land allotments. They have what are called the 7 grandfather teachings that call them to adhere to important and central tenets of their culture, which include humility and honesty and wisdom and bravery and truth and love and respect. We learn 2/3 of the way through the book that they have some prophecy that the young people will return to the old ways and take up the traditions and learn the language and put things right again. And I'm only very slightly exaggerating here when I say that that's basically all you'll learn from this book about what the Potawatomi specifically are about. And what does it mean to be a Potawatomi woman? Seemingly only to raise children that identify as Potawatomi, and that will hopefully fulfill this prophecy to return to the old ways and make things right. So anyway, we're at like a half hour here, so I think this is enough for one talk. Next week we'll finish this belonging section and go into the Rediscovering God, where the spoiler is that she's basically just like a Unitarian Universalist. And then from there, we'll get further into the stuff that Lori talked about in the trailer about how this is PMC hood run amok and therapeutic culture and things like that. So anyway, thanks for listening, and I'll hopefully see you next week.